You hear it before you see it, the absence of sound. You're standing in a corridor where even whispers usually echo off marble, where silk rustles and fountains murmur, and somewhere, always, there's the soft pad of footsteps. But not today. Today, the silence sits heavy, like something physical pressing against your chest. You glance toward the carved doors at the end of the hallway, and you notice the guards aren't just standing, watch, they're frozen, barely breathing, as if the stillness itself might shatter. Beyond those doors, in chambers draped with crimson and gold, a woman lies dying, and the entire palace, servants, soldiers, princes plotting in distant provinces, has stopped moving, waiting, holding its breath. If you're watching this from anywhere in the world right now, leave a comment and let me know. It genuinely amazes me how a single woman's final hours, centuries ago, can still reach across time and continents like this. Here's what they didn't tell you in the history books. April 1558. Topkapi Palace, heart of the Ottoman Empire. The woman behind those doors is Roxelana, known in the Islamic world as Harem Sultan. And she is the most dangerous person in the most powerful empire on earth. Not because of armies, not because of titles, but because for 3 decades she rewrote every rule about what a woman could be, could do, could survive. Born a slave, became a sultana, married the sultan himself, shattering 500 years of tradition, outlasted rivals who wanted her dead, raised sons who would fight over an empire. And now, as her body betrays her in ways no scheming enemy ever could, the question everyone is asking isn't will she die, it's what happens when she does. Because power in this palace isn't something you hold, it's something that holds you. And when you let go, even for a second, the fall is infinite. Let's go back 3 days. The physicians arrive at dawn, their robes smelling of rosewater and dread. They carry brass instruments, vials of amber liquid, scrolls of Greek and Arabic medical texts that promise remedies for every ailment known to man, except this one. Roxelana's body is swelling dropsy. They call it fluid gathering where it shouldn't. Her breathing shallow, her skin pale against the embroidered pillows. One physician, the eldest, checks her pulse at the wrist, then the neck, then the ankle. He doesn't need to say it. Everyone in the room knows. This isn't a disease you recover from. This is the body giving up. But Roxelana's eyes are still sharp. That's what the attendants remember later when they're questioned about her final days. Her body was failing, but her mind was a blade. She watches the physicians with a gaze that makes them uncomfortable, as if she's calculating how much time she has and what she can still accomplish with it. And maybe she is. Because when you've spent 30 years turning vulnerability into power, death is just another negotiation. Here's where it gets strange. Suleiman the Magnificent, the Sultan who conquered Belgrade and Rhodes and half of Hungary, who makes European kings tremble at the mention of his name, he visits her every evening. He's 74 now, his beard white as bone, his hands trembling not from fear but from age and exhaustion. He sits beside her bed, and sometimes he reads poetry aloud. Persian verses about nightingales and roses and the impermanence of beauty. Other times he just sits in silence, watching her breathe. The Venetian ambassador's report from this period is almost painful to read. The Sultan is absent in all but body. He does not hear counsel. He does not speak of war. He sits with the Sultana and waits. Think about that image. The most powerful man in the world, waiting, not commanding, not conquering. Just waiting for a woman to stop breathing. But here's what makes this unbearable. She's not ready. Roxelana has spent decades building something fragile and essential, a future for her sons that doesn't end in blood. Because the Ottoman throne has a law, unwritten but absolute. When a sultan dies, his sons race to the capital. Whoever gets there first becomes sultan. And then, to prevent civil war, he orders his brothers executed. All of them. One son lives. The rest are strangled with a silk cord and buried before sunset. That's the price of stability. That's how empires survive. Roxelana has two sons still alive, Selim and Bayezid. Both governors of distant provinces, both circling the succession like wolves. And she knows that the moment Suleiman dies, they'll tear each other apart, unless she stops it. So even now, with fever burning through her and her lungs barely pulling air, she's writing letters, or rather, dictating them. Her hand shakes too much to hold a pen, so scribes sit beside her bed, dipping reed brushes in ink, scratching her words onto parchment. Letters to Selim, letters to Bayezid, letters that sound like a mother's advice, but read like political blueprints. Be patient. Guard your alliances. Do not let ambition poison brotherhood. She's trying to prevent a war from beyond the grave. But the palace doesn't know this. They only see the closed doors, the untouched meals. The way even the birds seem quieter in the gardens outside her window. On the third day, something shifts. The physician emerges earlier than usual, walking with the slow, deliberate gait of a man delivering news he wishes he didn't have to deliver. He says nothing. He doesn't need to. Within an hour, the harem knows. Within 2 hours, the janissaries know. By evening, word has spread to the markets of Constantinople: Harem Sultan is dying. Not sick, not resting. Dying. The reactions fracture along 1,000 invisible lines. Some servants weep, those who remember how she built hospitals for the poor, how she funded schools, how she intervened when officials abused their power. Others exhale in relief, rivals who lived in her shadow, men whose careers she destroyed with a whisper, families who blamed her for Sultan Mustafa's execution years earlier. And some, like the ambassadors from Venice and France, simply write in their coded dispatches, "The order is changing. Prepare accordingly." Because everyone understands, Roxelana didn't just influence politics. She was the politics. For 30 years, she had been the invisible hand guiding decisions. The voice in the Sultan's ear. The woman who turned a harem into a nerve center of imperial strategy. Without her, the palace would have to remember how to function in her absence. And no one was sure it could. Here's the part that haunts me. On the evening of April 15th, 1558, Suleiman sits beside her for the last time. She's barely conscious now, drifting in and out, her breathing ragged. he's holding her hand, the same hand that once scratched out letters to queens in Europe. That signed charitable endowments that touched his face in private moments no historian will ever fully know. And she opens her eyes one last time. The attendant who recorded this moment said Roxelana asked a question. Just 2 words. The window? Suleiman didn't understand at first. Then he realized she wanted the shutters opened. She wanted to see outside. So he stood, walked to the window himself, and pulled the heavy wooden shutters wide. Afternoon light spilled in, golden and warm, and beyond it, the Bosphorus. That narrow strait where Europe and Asia almost touch, where 1,000 ships pass every day carrying silk and spices and stories. The water glittered. The sky was painfully blue. Roxelana looked at it for a long time. Then she closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed and then stopped. The palace held its breath, and then it screamed. Not literally. Empires don't scream. But the grief was immediate and public in ways that shocked even those who expected it. Suleiman ordered her body prepared with honors, usually reserved for royalty, no, beyond royalty. She was washed according to Islamic rites, wrapped in white silk embroidered with Quranic verses, carried on a bier through the palace grounds as janissaries lined the route in silence. And then she was buried not in some distant cemetery, but in a turb, a tomb directly beside the Suleimani Mosque, the architectural crown jewel that Suleiman had built to immortalize his reign. Her tomb was designed by Mimar Sinan, the greatest architect of the age, with Iznik tiles in blue and turquoise and gold. Intricate calligraphy spiraling up the walls, light filtering through stained glass to cast patterns on the marble floor. But here's the detail that breaks your heart if you let it. Suleiman positioned the tomb where he could see it from his private apartments in the mosque complex. He wanted her close. Even in death, he couldn't let her go. The empire, meanwhile, braced for what came next. Because Roxelana's death didn't just remove a person, removed a center of gravity. And within months, the fractures began to show. Selim and Bayezid, her sons, started positioning for the succession. Bayezid, the younger, more impulsive, sensed he'd be sidelined and rebelled openly. Suleiman, old and heartbroken, sided with Selim. The rebellion failed. Bayezid fled to Persia, begging the Safavid Shah for asylum. The Shah eventually handed him back for a staggering bribe. And in 1561, Bayezid and his 5 sons were executed in a single day. Roxelana's nightmare came true. 1 son lived. 1 son died. The letters she dictated on her deathbed didn't stop it. The mathematics of empire are indifferent to a mother's hope. But here's what's strange. They remembered her. Selim, who became Sultan Selim II, honored his mother obsessively. He completed every charitable project she'd begun: the hospitals, the schools, the soup kitchens in Mecca and Medina. He visited her tomb regularly, made sure it was maintained, ensured her name was spoken with reverence in Friday prayers. History calls him Selim the Drunkard, a weak ruler who let the empire drift. But he never forgot the woman who fought to keep him alive. And in the decades after her death, something unexpected happened. Roxelana became a legend, not just in Ottoman sources, but across Europe. Stories spread about the slave girl who seduced a sultan, the sorceress who controlled an empire, the woman who defied every rule and lived to tell the tale, except she didn't live, and that's what made the story immortal. Poets wrote about her. Painters imagined her. Diplomats invoked her name when they wanted to explain Ottoman politics to confused monarchs. She became shorthand for power that shouldn't exist, but does. The irony is that most of those stories got her wrong. They exoticized her, fantasized her, turned her into a symbol instead of a person. The real Roxelana, the one who lay dying in those chambers, who spent her last conscious moments dictating letters to save her sons, who asked to see the water one last time, that woman disappeared into myth. But not completely. Because there's a record buried in the Topkapi archives that almost no one talks about. A letter from Roxelana to Suleiman, written years before her death, discussing the construction of her charitable foundation in Jerusalem. And at the end, in a section that feels unguarded and raw, she writes, "I have lived in rooms of silk and gold, but I dream of open skies. I have moved the pieces on the board, but the board itself never moves." She knew that for all her power, she was still confined. The harem was gilded, yes, influential, absolutely. But it was still a cage. And the woman who could topple grand viziers with a letter couldn't walk freely through the city she helped shape. That's what stays with me. That tension. The simultaneous reality of immense power and immense constraint. Roxelana could start wars, but she couldn't leave the palace. She could marry a sultan, but she couldn't escape the succession's brutality. She could build monuments, but she couldn't stop her sons from destroying each other. The Bosphorus still flows outside that window. The tomb still stands. Tourists still visit, still take photos, still move on. The tiles still catch the light the way Sinan intended. But somewhere in the space between the legend and the woman, between the power and the prison, Roxelana remains not as history wants to remember her, but as she actually was. Someone who fought with everything she had, knowing the fight was never really hers to win. And on that April afternoon in 1558, when the palace held its breath and the window finally opened and she saw the water one last time, maybe that was enough. Maybe that was the only freedom that mattered. Not the freedom to control empires, but the freedom to choose what you see when you close your eyes. The water keeps moving. The palace keeps standing. And the silence eventually learned to breathe again.